So this lecture is about the required reading for this module, Sean Roberts' The War on Uyghurs. So Sean Roberts is an anthropologist. He's also the producer and director of our video or documentary for this unit, Waiting for Uyghurstan, a piece that he had done earlier and sort of which originally brought him to my attention. He's presently at George Washington University and is an expert both in anthropology as well as international development. And in fact, that is where he's situated, not in kind of a traditional anthropology department, but in an international development studies program. And I think, unlike the other two anthropologists' work that we've looked at over this quarter, this text is a bit different. And it's important to point out that with his role in international development studies, Sean Roberts has been an active consultant for the U.S. government for things like foreign policy, particularly for USAID. So he has a particular role, relation vis-a-vis Uyghur people and this particular conflict. So a little bit of a kind of an overview of this book, probably also interpreting it in a particular way. I'm also a scholar of this region, and so it's one of the texts that I'm probably going to both summarize but also be talking about in relationship to my understanding of the region and my experience in this region. And I think Sean Roberts does a good job. This is contested, and I think there are other historical narratives one could make, but he does sketch the historical background that is relevant for understanding the contemporary period, the contemporary conflict between Uyghur people and the Chinese state. So to kind of begin on this, sort of Roberts begins the narrative, and the beginning of narrative is always very, very important. And he sort of begins with this idea that the area of Xinjiang, and he's not happy using that term, he's going to use other terms that the Uyghur people, or some Uyghur people use. He's going to make this argument that that region is a more recent colonial addition to the Chinese state. And he places that into the Qing dynasty, 17th, 18th, 19th, and then into the very early 20th century, where that region really became a part of the political economy of China. You could definitely go earlier than that. So you could look at its integration during the period of the Yuan dynasty, much earlier in the 13th century, when it was part of the broader Mongolian Empire that was focused in China. Although, of course, there's always these discrepancies. You can look at the specifics of the political arrangement and relations between regions during the Yuan dynasty. You can go back earlier to the Han dynasty. And also, you're going to see discrepancies, right? There are political relationships and there's political integration, but kind of this notion of sovereign control, I don't take issue with the idea of the Qing really establishing a kind of sovereign control that was quite a bit different to the way that the region was integrated, let's say, in earlier historical moments. And again, I'm trying to recognize and not advocate here for one particular, let's say, side of this. I'm just trying to bring everyone in the class up to date, right, on where this text is coming from, where the historical material that he's using sort of presents the argument, right, for understanding the conflict. From Qing colonialism, if you have had some Chinese history, you may be familiar that 1911 is sort of the end of the Qing dynasty. Like other regions that we've talked about, the kind of modern world system and European colonialism shakes up the political economy of that time. And in 1911, you have the fall of the Qing dynasty and the older imperial order, and you have a sort of beginnings of what people call modern China, a republican government in China. And that period of nation building is also a period where you see very different ideas about, let's say, race and ethnicity being used to construct a new kind of nation, a new modern Chinese nation, where really there was an empire in the past. In this sense, I see this in many ways to be similar to the United States, with the idea that you have the British Empire kind of morphing into the U.S. State, right? The Republican state of the United States. And so, if you're not familiar with a lot of Chinese history, that may be one way of thinking about this period of Republican nation building, the movement from an empire to a modern state. Now, the Republican nation building was very explicitly, like the earlier imperial kind of order, it was multi-ethnic, and I kind of stated that's an existing understanding, right, within China. But in this text, you're really going to get that idea of that as being a kind of a political strategy rather than kind of a description, right? It's an attempt to incorporate peoples rather than being this objective representation of multi-ethnic peoples coming together to establish the new state. And he's quite accurate there. If you look at the historical evidence, this isn't just people coming together forming, a multi-ethnic state, but there is a lot of violence and there is a lot of domination and there's a lot of inequality that reflects those kinds of relations of the imperial period. That's quite accurate. 1911 to 1949 is this kind of Republican period, if you will, and then you have the collapse of that formation and the emergence of the one-party state, Chinese Communist Party, and the completion, right, of this project of moving from an empire to a modern state. Probably many of you are familiar with the tensions between religion and communist ideals. I think Karl Marx's axiom of religion being the opiate of the masses is probably one of these ways that this is understood kind of broadly, the tensions, right, between a kind of atheistic communism and a kind of religious view, that communist view as part of the older world order, the earlier feudal order that maintains people in a kind of subservient position. And obviously for areas where religion was very important to the worldview, was very important for the society and so on, there are a lot of conflicts that come out of 1949 in the way that the Chinese Communist Party wants to rule the nation and wants to really transform social relationships, traditional social relationships, including that between formal religious institutions, let's say, for the Islamic world, the Islamic schools, right, and the mosque systems, the system of what would be the equivalent, let's say, in Christianity as the church systems. And this is affecting Islam, but many of you are familiar, let's say, with the way this has affected and created tensions, right, with other religious communities, Buddhist communities in China, Christian communities in China as well. And so this is kind of the historical background that he sketches out in this text to help a reader understand and come to terms with what's happening in the contemporary moment. So he's really trying to avoid a presentist perspective. And there's a reason for this too. So we've been looking at ethnographic work that is traditionally grounded in an ethnographic method. What is an ethnographic method? That is, as we learned, knowing the language, being on the ground in a community over a long period of time, and so on. And the kind of historical nature of this text reflects that it's not an ethnographic work. He states very clearly that he has not been to this region in 20 years, and a lot of the work that he is doing here is based on text. It's based on texts from the region, as well as the expatriate communities. And this is very important. So Sean Roberts is, developing these arguments in tangent with the community of Uyghur who have left this region. They've moved across the border into Kazakhstan, where a lot of his work has been, where he's really done a lot of this research, as well as advised for the U.S. government, democratization kinds of things in a country like Kazakhstan. So there's that kind of element to it. And I think that's important. I mean, this is an information literacy class, and the perspective we get here is a perspective that would not be ethnographic. It is really rooted in a particular narrative of history that's associated with those expatriate communities. Now, I don't say that to say that this is a flawed text, but I do want you to note the way that we get a very, very specific perspective on the situation by listening to certain sources and excluding others. So, like other texts that have become pretty popular on this region, this uses very little, let's say, in-country scholarship, in-country data and information. And in one way, that's good because it provides a new perspective, provides a new way of understanding this. It really highlights the expatriate community's perspective, foreign Uyghur perspectives. But it does, I think, in a way, distort some of the understandings one would get if one was on the ground using citizens from the region and their understandings using the existing documents. That may be a flawed understanding in its own way, but we also could say that this is a flawed understanding, that none of these perspectives, right, are complete, and they're all incomplete and partial in the understandings that they give us. So to understand this issue of the war on Uyghurs, we not only have to understand the complicated political history of the integration of a Uyghur region like the Tarim Basin into the political geographical territory of China, but then there's this kind of more contemporary history of what is being called terrorism and what Roberts is going to sort of problematize in terms of the term terrorism. And so in my understanding, there were some violence, acts of violence, or there is some evidence of struggle that can be found in the written record within the country from the period of 1949 to 1989, and which we're going to use as a marker for time for the Soviet Union, the collapse, the breakup of the Soviet Union. So the Chinese Communist Party, while its communist philosophy or theory is distinct from that of the Soviet Union, some of its ideas about nationality and ethnicity and the use of notions of autonomy, political autonomy for minority ethnic groups does share a lot with the Soviet Union. And in 1989, the Soviet Union collapses, and you have the independence of many of the former ethnic autonomous regions. So I mentioned Kazakhstan. And before 1989, there is no such thing as Kazakhstan as an independent country, but there is a Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, which was a region of the Soviet Union, one republic in the broader Soviet Union. And while there was a Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic government, and it had its own, let's say, bylaws and things that varied very, very slightly from that of the Soviet Union. It was highly integrated, and it pursued the policies of the Soviet Union as a whole. And you didn't have anything like an international boundary between one republic or another. You didn't have like an internal passport control, as you might think. So it was effectively like the Soviet Union is really one kind of state, and then these republics. Maybe if we wanted to shorthand kind of understand this in terms of the U.S., it'd be like the federal government versus the state level government, although the relations between them were quite a bit different in the Soviet Union. And so with the collapse of the Soviet system and then the independence of many ethnic minority regions, in 1989, this presents quite a bit of anxiety and tension for the Chinese Communist Party and for the Chinese government. So the Chinese Communist Party was also undergoing some liberalization, and some of this comes to a real head of conflict with what many people know as the Tiananmen Square massacre, when there is this democracy movement that is crushed, right, by force by the Chinese state. And while that's happening in eastern parts of China, or at least the narratives we get here in the West are from places like Tiananmen Square, right, or Beijing. There are other similar movements that are happening in other cities. And in fact, in Xinjiang, there are also some protests for more independence, more ethnic autonomy in some form that are coming out of sort of awareness of what's happening in the Soviet Union, awareness of minorities about what's happening, the greater independence and greater authority and autonomy that, say, minority Kazakh are pursuing across the border. And so one of the things that we see is in this period, the Bahrain incident. He talks about this in his text, that there is a violent uprising that occurs in the Xinjiang region against the Chinese government that has these kind of loose relationships to what become labeled terrorist organizations, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement and the Turkestan Islamic Party. Kind of loose relations that start a narrative of Uyghur terrorism against the state. And it's from that period, particularly from the Bahrain incident, that we see a kind of new dynamic where the state is targeting Islamic terrorism among Uyghur people. The state is targeting kind of Uyghur ethno-nationalism as part of that violence, as sort of Uyghur nationalists, right, begin to try to, this is the narrative, begin to fight or struggle for a Uyghurstan, for an Eastern Turkestan. As they begin to struggle for this, drawing on, let's say, historical narrative and past political events, past political relationships in this region. And then there begins to be other kind of events through time that are then put into this plot, right, of the development of terrorism in the region. And for Sean Roberts, right, this is this kind of dynamic that emerges after the Bahrain incident, where the state now is starting to respond to what it's calling terrorism, is also a part of increasing state repression against what Sean Roberts would argue is not terrorism, but is actually a political struggle. And he would really argue that it's legitimate political struggle against the Chinese state, that the Chinese state is dominating the region, the Chinese state is not giving Uyghur people political freedoms, political rights, political liberties, and that rather than aping or reproducing the narrative of the Chinese state, that it's suppressing Uyghur terrorism, that in fact there's something very different happening here, that in order to legitimate the repression of Uyghur nationalism and Uyghur political struggle, right, this narrative has come to be accepted by the international community, that this is legitimate, that these are terrorists who are targeting in civilian populations, rather than a kind of more definitive definition of terrorism as the illegitimate attack of civilian targets. So the Bahrain incident was focused on government and police targets. It wasn't focused on civilians. And while there are incidences of political violence in the region that are oriented towards civilians, that's not the case for all of the acts of violence, that there are actually quite a few events that have been recorded that are groups that are targeting the Chinese state. In Sean Roberts' understandings of international policy and law and so on, he wouldn't include that in the definition of what terrorism is. And then really what his argument is about is how the Chinese state's narrative of terrorism is delegitimating Uyghur struggle against the state. And so this is where the notion of the connections between, let's say, colonialism, the longer political history, right, with new movements for counterterrorism are really leading to something that is genocidal, that is leading to something that is a form of, if not genocide itself cultural genocide. And there's a number of different reasons why he's making this argument. And despite maybe the discrepancies in some of the arguments that he's making and some of the problematizations we can make, there is a kind of wide international acceptance that new counterterrorism measures to deal with the so-called Uyghur separatism, Uyghur terrorism, and so on, that we have something that's really beyond traditional counterterrorism and is moving towards something that can be thought about in terms of genocide, could be argued both ways, and that scholars need to pay more attention to what is happening because there's something beyond, right, just suppressing terrorism to something that is potentially destroying an ethnic group. So potentially destroying the Uyghur people. And the argument that he's going to make is that contemporary attempts to deal with acts of violence, to deal with terrorism and so on, have entered a new phase from 1989, 1990. There have been a lot of acts of violence. And what the Chinese state is arguing is that, in fact, the Muslim population in the region is radicalizing. That the kind of terrorism that we saw with 9/11 in the United States, groups like Al-Qaeda and so on, groups like the Taliban, are influencing Muslim peoples like the Uyghur. Uyghur people are increasingly engaging more radical forms of Islam, more violent forms of Islam. And so they began to develop, really from about 2018, a new series of initiatives. I lump these under the People's War Against Terrorism, although he would put that a little bit earlier than 2018. And what this new policy towards the Uyghur people generally, not just terrorists. When I first got there in 1999, it had been after the bombing in the regional capital in 1991. And at that time, you did see checkpoints, you set metal detectors and so on. And generally, the region was becoming under kind of a securitization that was new from the more local approaches that had been seen, let's say, in earlier periods of time. Well, with the People's War Against Terrorism, this is really amped up so that the Chinese government begins to create these re-education camps, what Sean Roberts calls concentration camps for Uyghur people. That the idea is that the Uyghur people generally are beginning to have thought problems, that they're beginning to not understand their history correctly, they're not understanding the rights and responsibilities of the state towards them as citizens, that they do not understand their rights and responsibilities to the Chinese state, and they are doing an involuntary re-education where if you are deemed to be a potential threat to the Chinese state, and the potential threats here fall within the realm of, well, any observer, and this is something that people would not argue, like myself would not argue with Sean Roberts, that things that fall within the general scope of Muslim practice, that have nothing to do with radical Islam, that have nothing to do with terrorism, just everyday prayer, everyday Islamic things such as men growing beards, naming practices. I mean, I could literally put a list here that is almost ad infinitum of cultural practices of the Uyghur, that you will be deemed a threat and you will be placed in a camp for re-education. You will be interned against your will, and you will be taught Chinese law, Chinese language. You'll be taught what is good Islam, what is bad Islam. And there are reports that due to the nature of the local political economy in this region, so like other minorities that we've looked at, minorities in China also face things like higher levels of poverty, lower levels of literacy or education, higher levels of unemployment, and so on, that the re-education's kind of been bundled with forced labor, that the state, of course, is narrating things such as they are transforming these people from being potential radical Muslim terrorists to they're teaching them about what a modern citizen is. They're teaching them about their possibilities in the new Chinese employment market, new Chinese economy. They are training them for the kinds of jobs that are available in industry. They're actually literally combining the re-education camps with factories that, from an outside perspective, we would call forced labor. That they this is involuntary. They don't have a choice. That while people may find coping strategies to smile, to say, okay, there is no other option, right? If they don't smile, if they don't go along with this, if they don't say they are happy, if they don't say they made mistakes in the past, they are subject to violence. They're subject to coercion. They're subject to very difficult situations in these re-education camps, psychological medication, torture, and so on. And so, yes, the kind of outside observers are very concerned about this nature of this very, very authoritarian approach to the problem of so-called terrorism in the region. Now, of course, the Chinese state has an interest in social order. The Chinese state does have rights and obligations to its Han majority in the region to protect them from violence and so on. But what we're seeing really from any kind of observational perspective goes beyond what we would say is acceptable. Now, there have been international observers that have not criticized the plans and that believe there's quite a bit of sensationalization that's occurring. And I would say that there has been sensationalization. I do think Uyghur activists have distorted what's happening to serve their own goals. They've kind of taken the narrative in a way that doesn't give the full picture. And that's kind of the nature of information, that no information gives a full picture. But that I offer you Sean Roberts' work because from what we're describing here, right, there are problems in this region around issues of human rights. That if we're thinking about multiculturalism and the idea, the liberal order where we move beyond individual rights to providing group rights for people, we do not have that in this region. That the general group rights of Uyghur people are not being respected in this region. Widespread surveillance, people will talk about, and it's very widespread, that the region is sort of like a concentration camp. You don't have to actually be in one of these re-education camps to feel as though you are under a totalitarian regime. You're under 24/7 surveillance and policing. Let's say the regional capital, just to get into it from the airport, you're going to go through a number of different checkpoints. Any kind of public institution has the metal detectors that you might associate with the TSA. If you're going to go to a mall in the regional capital, you're going to have to put your bags, you're going to have to potentially have a body search and so on. And I've been in this region, and I can supplement what is being said here, is that if you are Han Chinese, you can be waved through these, that there is a profiling that's occurring, that if you have any kind of ethnic minority symbols, if you have anything in terms of clothing, hair, if you have any phenotypical racial kinds of markings that would place you as a minority and not as a majority Han, you are going to be asked to go through the surveillance. You're going to be asked to go through the security. If when your ID is checked, because the identification will mark you as either a majority or a minority, you will be put through extra kinds of security that most people in this region are unhappy and discontent and recognize as 过分 in Chinese, right? It's gone too far. That this, even in the kind of a very moderate, if not conservative minority, this is not somebody who is advocating for minority rights. This is not somebody who is seeking independence of the region, seeking independence for Uyghur. Those people who see themselves as very good Chinese citizens, as seeing no contradiction between being Uyghur and being a Chinese citizen, that they are being targeted, that their rights are being trampled upon. This is really not arguable at this point. That the counterterrorism is moving towards something that can be argued to be genocidal, even if maybe you're seeing 10% of the population being interned, 90% of the Uyghur are not interned, 90% of the Uyghur are trying to adapt to the situation, that this doesn't fit any kind of classical situation of genocide, that really arguing over what we're going to label this, if we want to say maybe that's not our work, we'll leave that up to the legal experts, right? That there are deep problems and the group rights of people are clearly being infringed upon, that we need reform of these policies. This, I think, there is widespread consensus among observers today. So Robert's analysis is going to make the argument that, well, from the period of reform, I did say that there was evidence of conflict under the kind of traditional Maoist or communist or socialist period up to 1989. This is under Mao Zedong, collective planning, and so on. And with the liberalization that we talked about with 1989, there has been attempts to better incorporate Xinjiang into the broader political economy of China. But that has in many ways failed and only increased problems, as the state has sought to expand economic development that first developed around the coastal regions into the western kinds of regions through things like this Open the West policy, where new kinds of investment initiatives are made for places like Xinjiang. For now, the Silk Road Economic Belt and Road Initiative, as it's sometimes known, that's actually accentuating the contradictions and the problems between ethnic groups in this region. Because the Han are the majority, because there is already inequality between the majority and the minority, when you have new economic initiatives like this, and we're talking about huge capital kinds of initiatives, that they are disproportionately benefiting the Han over minority groups. And that has been a source of conflict, that in fact expressions of Uyghur discontent are increasing and multiplying. I have no problem with that analysis. It's been made before. This is not a new analysis that he's making in this particular text. There is a lot of evidence for that. There is evidence that in fact the period from 1949 to 1989, those 40 years, that there was more equitable development under a communist central planning or socialist central planning than the new market initiatives that happened after 1989. On the one hand, you had liberalization of the economy, but you did not have political liberalization. You still have a one-party state. You have a state that has that dictatorship of the proletariat. It has a party line that cannot be questioned after it's implemented. And for economic liberalization, that's allowing market initiatives, allowing capital in the basis of majority-minority relations that are unequal, without political liberalization, without political avenues where communities can challenge, right, policy. We have problems, we have conflicts. And the government's policy simply has not been adequate. And that's the critique you're getting. You have this notion that it's really ethnic autonomy and these autonomous regions that granted autonomy that have only led to the growth of minority identities, national identities. And so at the same time you have liberalization, you've actually had the undermining of what we might have said is a more multicultural policy in the past, where from the discussion that we have had up to this point, you might not get the sense that Uyghur is nothing like an endangered language. Tibetan is not an endangered language. That in fact these languages have been used in government, that the state has supported minority language media and so on. This is completely different than, let's say, the genocide that occurred here in the inland Northwest, where native languages are endangered, and you have very big effects on things like standard of living and so on. This is quite a bit different in this region, where really from 1949 to 1989, you would have something that may appear to be more multicultural, more group right based than from the period of 1989, where those rights are being undermined by policy. The rights to use language is being challenged and undermined. So much, though, that this is a Xinjiang Uyghur region, but there's really no longer a curriculum in Uyghur. Well, that's not the way it's always been. There have been schools in minority languages, and those have been intact. And sometimes it's not because there are simply just bad Han who want to undermine Uyghur policy, but as they've seen inequality increasing in the post-1989 period, there's this idea that there's the minority schools, Min Kao Min, and there are these Han schools, and there are minority populations that have gone to Han schools, what is called Min Kao Han, those who go to a minority goes to a Han school and ends up, let's say, with a higher income, better Chinese language skills, more successful integration in the state. And so the state, in a very, very simplistic way, is sort of targeting minority education as the problem. That, okay, the solution then is all minorities go to Han schools, learn Chinese, don't learn their own language, and they're going to be better off, which is an incredibly simplistic policy. And unfortunately, the authoritarian nature of the Chinese state is they're not listening. They're not listening to many scholars, both within the country. They're not listening to international scholars. In fact, they are attacking scholars who are more critical. And so this is why you're getting these arguments about cultural repression and cultural genocide. On this topic, on this particular image here, is a photograph I've taken in which just in 2019, this is evidence where the state has outlawed a religious holiday. So Korban, this would be the equivalent of Christmas. If you could only imagine the United States outlawing Christmas at home, that you can't put up a Christmas tree, that you can't put up Christmas decorations, that you can't gather as families for the Christmas holiday. This would not be acceptable. And it's not acceptable for a scholar like myself either when I'm looking at state policy. This is Korban. It's a very important holiday for Muslims. It's a very important holiday for Chinese Muslims. And the Chinese government, to control the gatherings of Muslims and the fear that just a normal holiday like Korban is going to be used for extremists to gather, that they're going to hide under, right, the Korban holiday to do illegal kinds of activities, that they just say that no Muslim can do this. No Muslim can celebrate Korban. No Muslim can gather at this time. And it's really hard to legitimate that, to rationalize that. That is experienced as repression. It's experienced as antagonistic and repressive. And it's what he makes the argument for is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more oppressive the state gets, the more people are going to push back. The more people are going to question the authority of the Chinese state. The more people are going to question the legitimacy of the Chinese state. The more, in particular, young people, and this is probably less in this book, but we're seeing it in some of the literature, that young people, if they're not assimilating, if they're not really adapting, and that's happening, absolutely, they are rejecting, right, any kind of future with the Chinese state. They are more likely to embrace radical ideologies than at any other point in Chinese history, which for observers like ourselves who are trying to understand diversity or, really do seek to celebrate Chinese diversity is quite sad. It's really quite a sad story. So in conclusion, talking about the Roberts book and what Roberts adds to our understanding of minorities in China and diversity in China, and particularly the experience of the Uyghur minority, is taking this historical perspective that today there's a notion of a Uyghur separatist movement and Uyghur political violence, right, attacking civilians, but that's a simplistic story. We need to have better historical understanding of the political conflict between this particular ethnic minority group and the state, the overuse of the idea of terrorism, and in fact the way the Chinese state has used terrorism to craft a narrative that's even got the U.S. government to support labeling, in the past, groups like the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement as a terrorist group or the Turkestan Islamic Party as a terrorist group. When there are other narratives. And I'm not making the narrative that those aren't terrorist groups and those shouldn't be labeled terrorist groups and that there isn't terrorism. That is not what your instructor is saying here. But in talking about Sean Roberts' book, he is saying that the kind of more detailed analysis of some of the political events, political acts of violence, question the idea that these groups are always involved, that it's actually these terrorist groups in the first place, and that they're not always attacking civilian targets, that sometimes it's spontaneous anger, resentment at the exploitation of Uyghur, at the inequality, that spontaneously spills over into violence against the Chinese state, against police, against military, against economic interests, and so on, a mine, for example, and that's something different than what the story that the Chinese narrative has crafted. That under this rubric of counterterrorism, of fighting terrorism, that we have a kind of simmering cultural genocide, that the way of life, that was sketching out very quickly in the last lecture for Uyghur people is being undermined, is being destroyed, is being threatened. That this really is the central idea